The book of Proverbs talks about the fear of the Lord as something that doesn't just affect our individual lives, but something that affects all of society. There's no sense of a privatized religion when it comes to the wisdom that God gives us through the book of Proverbs. So, a society that honors God is going to create an atmosphere in which the wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion. That's how chapter 28 of Proverbs begins. The wicked walk around with this low-grade anxiety because they know that God and his righteous rulers will find them out. The righteous, on the other hand, act with boldness because they know that the Lord will bless their efforts. There's no hint, again, of a religion that's just your internal spiritual dialogue in your head. But rather, when a land transgresses, it has many rulers. But with a man of understanding and knowledge, its stability will long continue. Verse 2 of chapter 28. So if you get God out of the public sector, then everything else becomes a battle over resources. It's a bid for power by different rulers and factions. Politicians feel no obligation to any greater authority than their own interests. And we get the kind of leaders that we deserve. So if we want a stable and prosperous society, we need stable, God-fearing, wise leaders. And so a righteous culture will ensure justice, that the poor neither experience oppression or oppress others. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand it completely. Proverbs 28:4. So society without God becomes morally bankrupt. They're corrupt in their understanding and distorted in their perspective. They praise the wicked and oppress the righteous. But those who seek the Lord must remain vigilant against all evil to preserve the order and justice of the community. So a lot is at stake. It's not just a private religion, but something that impacts all the spheres of life. This is Understanding Proverbs. Proverbs 28 continues talking about wealth and justice and the foundations of a just society by, again, talking about how the way we handle money reveals our hearts, and the way that a community, a city, or a nation views money reveals the righteous fiber of that country, that people, that group. So a rightly ordered community is going to value integrity over wealth, 28:6. And honor father and mother over illicit gain, verse 7. Those who greedily gather wealth through interest and profit only store up the funds of those willing to show generosity. Again, God is the defender of the poor. People who try to charge enormous amounts of interest to gain greedy wealth, God says, I'm the one who's ultimately in control of all these things, and all of your greedy accumulation will just fill the storehouses of those who are willing to be generous to those who have little. Regardless of their social standing, God intends the land to sustain the life of all of his people, and anything that deviates from this purpose constitutes injustice, verse 8. All the religious rituals in the world mean nothing if not accompanied by heartfelt obedience. So the man who prays in the assembly and lavishes expensive offerings while walking in unrepentant sin arrogantly parades his hypocrisy before God. God doesn't care about our sacrifices if they're not accompanied with a broken and contrite heart, a humble heart that seeks to obey God in all that he commands. The blameless rather than the rich receive a good inheritance, but the allure of wealth deceives many into the pit, verse 10. The poor man who fears the Lord perceives the world with greater clarity and understanding than the man who's drunk on the self-delusion that wealth often affords. Verse 11. When material gain becomes the ultimate goal of society, the poor get oppressed, religion becomes superficial, and pride reigns supreme. What we need is a just human ruler, somebody who exemplifies godly character. Proverbs 28:12 to the end of the chapter talks about humanity under godly human rule, and also the contrast when humanity is under evil, wicked human rule. Just societies need just leaders. They set things in proper order. Righteous rulers bring glory to the people, But tyrants spread a regime of fear, verse 12. This regime of fear proliferates by corrupt men who conceal their transgressions through backhanded deals and manipulative planning. Despite their initial success, the Lord promises swift calamity on the wicked, to break their hard hearts, and to bless those who fear him. So righteousness manifested in the public sphere ensures the common good of all. So Christians must not abdicate their public witness, but seek to establish righteous laws, policies, and institutions for the good of their neighbor, verses 13 to 14. When the righteous fail to do this, the wicked gain power and oppress people, like a roaring lion or a charging bear, verse 15. So the lack of compassion for people displayed by evil rulers reveals their ignorance of the truth. They do not recognize that God will prolong the days of the righteous, verse 16. They think they can escape final justice, but in the end, all of their wickedness will come back upon their heads. And the righteous ruler ensures that murderers never escape justice, verse 17, that the crooked get what's coming to them, verse 18, and that people who plow their land ought to receive a proper harvest, verse 19. People are paid what they are owed. People are not being manipulative with money. They are trustworthy. All of these things flow downstream from a society that values the wisdom of God. This kind of society is going to promote diligent and disciplined hard work over get-rich-quick schemes, verse 20. Wisdom also provides a moral anchor, so that we do not show partiality to the rich or to the poor. A just society also shows mercy and makes provision for certain situations. For example, a good judge will be lenient on a man who robs a store to feed his family. So we don't want to be overly exacting. We want to have some nuance in adjudicating certain issues. But stingy and greedy men who live their lives chasing wealth under a just system will get what's coming to them. And hopefully they'll realize that they're actually speeding headlong into poverty. They're unable to master their appetites, and so they end up spending their wealth on frivolous pursuits. Verse 22. Wickedness also infects both the political and familial spheres. So when a ruler forsakes truth-telling friends and instead surrounds himself with flattering fools, people who just tell him what he wants to hear, well, he's placing himself on a path toward destruction. Verse 23. In a similar way, when a son forsakes the righteousness and wisdom of his father, he is robbing his father and mother. He's actually committing a crime against them while downplaying that crime as no transgression. Verse 24. It's the depths of wickedness to steal from your parents and then to act as if it's no big deal. His priorities are completely out of line, and his sense of justice is completely inverted. But God is going to thwart the plans of the wicked and establish the desires of the righteous. So the greedy, they create strife. They're grabbing for money and it causes conflict. But the wealth that they desire actually gets funneled to the righteous. Verse 25. So fools are going to trust in their own wisdom. That's how they think they're going to get ahead. But only those who trust the Lord find real deliverance. Verse 26. So the man who shuts his eyes to the poor is going to find himself cursed. He curses the poor, he becomes cursed. By contrast, those who open their hands in generosity to the poor, they find blessing. They refuse to curse the poor, and God brings blessing upon their lives. Verse 28. So the righteous need to cast out the wicked so that righteousness may increase in the land. And when good men do nothing, the entire community falls apart. Verse 29. So we can see there's this other-centeredness to a wise, righteous man. And he has to trust that even though the wicked may make their plots and they may gain some initial victories, in the end, God will ensure that their plans be thwarted. He will ensure that the foolish son and the wicked ruler will get what is coming to them. Now that leads to this next section about receiving correction and specifically taming the tongue in chapter 29, verses 1 to 15. Verse 1 and 15 of 29 bracket this section with references to heeding reproof, to being reproved, being corrected. So the man who receives correction, but then responds by doubling down on his folly, is going to suddenly experience the dire consequences of his actions. It's going to be one deadly moment. So he may be foolish and he gets away with it little by little, but these small actions will lead to a devastating effect in a moment when he least expects it. We see at the end of this section in verse 15, the fool rejects wisdom and he shames his mother. It's a direct violation of the fifth commandment to honor your father and mother in verse 15. So these examples of refusing correction highlight how small acts and consistent habits bring about exponential outcomes. So a society that takes time to raise righteous people brings joy to the community. But wickedness causes the people to groan, verse 2. In verse 15, when you shun wisdom, you bring shame upon your mother. But if you receive wisdom, in verse 3, you bring joy to your father. It makes him glad. So a king who faithfully builds his kingdom with justice causes the land to prosper. But when he becomes exacting and merciless, the kingdom crumbles. Again, you bring honor to your people and you bring honor to your parents when you live righteously and wisely. It's actually a blessing to other people. But when you are cursing the wisdom of God and you reject wisdom, it ensnares you in a trap. And we see this in the next two verses about flattery. Flattery not only ensnares others in a trap, but it harms the one who flatters. He tries to use his words to elevate his status by saying nice things to people and gaining their favor by being deceptive with his words, which is what flattery is. It's a form of deception. But in the end, he ends up ensnared in his own transgression. But the righteous man who refuses flattery ends up singing and rejoicing. So you can see that the foolish person thinks he's getting ahead, but really he's dragging himself behind. And the righteous man is the man who will be elevated, who does not use flattery to gain a standing. Righteous men instead, they care for the poor, but the wicked are distorted in their moral vision. They don't even understand the meaning of justice. And instead, they set the city aflame by scoffing at God's law. And the Old Testament spends a great deal of time emphasizing God's wrath against those who scoff at his law and who oppress the weak and needy, verses 7 to 8. So the righteous and wicked are often distinguished by the way that they speak and the way that they listen. Fools hate hearing from wise men. So if you are a wise man, you have to exercise prudence in speaking to a fool. Is it worth your time? Especially if they're a bloodthirsty man. Then they're going to hate you and probably cause you violence. So avoid them, verses 9 to 10. The wise are going to exercise restraint in their words, while the fool just blabbers on and on. He gives full vent to his spirit. We're not supposed to say everything that's on our mind, but rather to master our tongue. If you master your tongue, you can master your life. So discernment extends to what we give ear to as well. If a ruler listens to falsehood, all his officials will be wicked. So you've got to choose carefully the voices you allow to influence you. If you allow people who are liars to influence you, that folly will quickly spread and go through all the ranks of the people that are under you and through all of your counsel, and so you want to nip that in the bud. You want to make sure that lies do not spread and that you are careful with the people you surround yourself with, verses 11 to 12. God is the source of life for both the rich and the poor, and if this is the case, then kings cannot show partiality to either, but must execute justice as God's representative, verses 13 to 14. If God cares about justice, and God cares about impartiality, and God cares about the poor, then the king who represents God to the people must have those same priorities. Now, the remainder of this chapter deals with how righteousness and wisdom function within various social relationships in verses 16 to 27 of chapter 29. Despite the current social influence of the wicked, God ensures that the righteous will see their downfall. Verse 16. Once again, faith in Proverbs is believing that God's word will prove true at the right time, in the end. A father expresses sorrow in the present by giving the pain of discipline. It's painful for himself. He doesn't like inflicting pain upon his child. But he's doing that he might secure both his and his son's future rest and joy. Present pain later yields the fruit of peace and righteousness. And the opposite is true if a father refuses to discipline his son. He's going to bring only greater sorrow upon himself and his child in the end, when his son lacks the wisdom to skillfully navigate life in a godly manner. Verse 17. So the one who keeps the law, especially in a lawless dark age, has prophetic vision, not in the sense that he's telling the future, but rather he safeguards the law of God in evil times. It's written in his heart. He is an embodiment of the truth, especially in contrast to the wickedness that is around him. The righteous who endure the pressures to conform to lawlessness are going to find blessing because God is going to care for them and be their refuge in times of trouble. Verse 18. Verse 19 is a bit odd. It depicts the way that a master uses physical discipline to correct his servant when mere words are going to fail. We might find this distasteful, but in the ancient Near East context, servants were often treated as members of the family, and in that sense, bringing physical discipline is an appropriate way to treat your son. And so a master must not coddle his servant, but show them the kind of love and care and discipline that he would show a member of his own family. Hasty words often lead to bad results. Sure, we've learned this lesson multiple times. If you're listening, you've probably caught yourself in this moment. If you aren't thinking about the things that you say, it shows a lack of patience and prudence and a lack of desire to step back from a situation to gain perspective. And a fool has more hope than this kind of person. Verse 21. Those are strong words. That it is utter folly to not think about the words that you speak. That you have to take care and think through how you are addressing certain situations and whether you are actually applying God's wisdom in a proper way. In the same way, a man who gets easily angered, easily triggered, he creates this vortex of strife and transgression. Again, maybe you know people like this. Maybe you are like this sometimes. And what does he want at his core? He wants to assert his pride. But in the end, that pride brings him low. Conversely, those who are low and humble are elevated. They gain honor because of his restraint. He's not all about himself. He's not just blabbering his words. He doesn't just love the sound of his own voice, but he has self-control and prudence over his words, and God elevates that man, verses 22 to 23. We are not just liable for our sins, but also in the way that we cooperate with the sins of others. A man who partners with a thief to gain riches for his life ends up hating his life. He fears the opinions of his partner and refuses to disclose his evil plans, verse 24. So the fear of man that he has ends up being a snare for him in the end. And the only way that he can counteract the fear of man is by fear of the Lord. Whoever trusts in the Lord is safe, verse 25. And part of trusting God means looking forward to the judgment of God. We may appeal to rulers and kings for justice, and that's good. But in the end, they're fallible. And they are finite men. Ultimate justice comes only from the Lord, verse 26. Therefore, you've got to adopt the same perspective as God does upon the unrighteous. You have to value the things that God values, and you have to be against the things that God is against. They are abominations. The wicked are abominations to God. And so just as we are not to partner with evil, we must partner with righteousness. We must also have the attitude toward evil that the righteous have, that they do not accept it. They're not okay with it. They view them as a perversion of God's goodness. And so the pursuit of wisdom is going to bring us necessarily into conflict with the world and the folly of the wicked. And unless we're rooted and grounded in faith, we will not endure the pressures to conform to folly. But the heart of wisdom is this, that you trust that God is active, alive in this world, and working on behalf of the righteous. And that as we plod through this life of ups and downs, that is our moral compass, our North Star, that if we obey the words of God, in the end, they will prove true, and we will enjoy all the blessings that God has stored up for the righteous.